Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Capital Ideas, where we explore the innovation and innovators that enrich our lives and the capital markets that turn those ideas into reality. I'm Nick Morgan, the co-founder of Investor Choice Advocates Network and one of the co-hosts of today's episode of Capital Ideas.
I'm Mark Hiride, a co-host of Capital Ideas and Senior Legal Director and Policy Counsel at ICANN.
And I'm Darrell Albright. I'm co-host of Capital Ideas and a very proud board member of ICANN. And speaking of innovators, today we are joined by Dr. Scott Stornetta. He is the man whose work helped inspire one of history's most transformative innovations. And of course, I'm referring to Scott's work in the early 1990s on digital timestamping and immutable records, which, if you haven't figured it out yet, laid the foundation for blockchain and is also cited throughout Satoshi Nakatomi's 2009 Bitcoin white paper. So today, Scott is the CEO of Shoremark Digital, and his focus is on solving a very different but equally fundamental problem: identity in an AI-driven world. So, Scott, welcome to Capital Ideas.
Pleasure to be on. Nice to meet everyone.
So much of the world has changed, particularly with regard to blockchain technology since the 1990s. We've been through lots of SEC interest in the application of some blockchain technologies. And today we see legislation that we'll talk about a little bit, I think, during the course of the episode. But it's probably a good place to start is at the beginning. So maybe we could go back to the 90s, and Dara alluded to some of this, but maybe you could talk a little bit about how your paper, How to Timestamp Digital Document, became so innovative and such a, I mean, I don't want to overstate it, and you're probably too modest to call it the genesis of Bitcoin, but we can say that. So can you tell us a little bit more about what that paper was about and what it means today?
Sure. So just to put it in proper historical context, I was just finishing up my PhD at Stanford University, but I also had an office at Xerox PARC, which is the Xerox Palo Alto Research Center. And that was kind of a legendary place because it's where all of the bitmapped graphics and object-oriented programming and Windows style operating system. It's famously known as the place that both Bill Gates and Steve Jobs pillaged to create the Macintosh and Windows. But it was a super exciting place to do research. And I guess where I'm going with that is every time I stepped in the door there, it felt like I was transported 15 years into the future. And because we were fully networked, everything was on the internet before the internet and the World Wide Web were, what they are. All of us had workstations that were Mac precursors. And it led me to think, what is this world going to be like when everything is in digital form? And there are no paper records or backup copies on paper or on disk. How will we be able to tell the difference between an original document and one that was altered 10 milliseconds before it popped up on your screen? And so I became somewhat obsessed with this issue of how can we create immutable records when it's just the bits. And I was very fortunate when I graduated with my PhD to be hired into Bell Communications Research, part of the old Bell Labs system. So moving from Palo Alto on the left coast to New Jersey on the East Coast. And I had the opportunity to work with Dr. Stuart Haber, a well-known cryptologist. And almost from day one, when I arrived there, probably in the first week that I was there, I walked down the hall to Stuart's office and said, there's a problem that is going to be a real issue someday. And I had a dissertation advisor who himself was a Nobel laureate, who said the way to solve important problems is to find out about them, identify them before the smart people get a hold of them. And I said to Stuart, we should work on this problem before all the smart people get to it. Namely, how can we create an immutable record when all we have is bits and no medium that it's written on? And so that's how, for me, what we now call the blockchain story began. And we were interested in creating a universal ledger that everyone could trust. And we worked on it for a while and got to a pretty decent point. But the problem was you still had to have a trusted third party. And I said to Stuart, what we really need to do is to remove the trusted third party. Then everyone can believe the same record. And he said, okay, let's give it a shot. And so we worked on it for several weeks. And finally, Stuart sort of pulled me aside and said, Scott, I don't think we can remove the trusted third party requirement. So, but I still want to get a paper out of this. So why don't we write a proof that you can't remove a trusted third party from a system? And I was a little discouraged, but he was the more senior person. So I said, okay, let's go for the proof. And so we're working on this proof. And long story short, it was in the process of writing the proof that we realized that, in fact, the proof we were writing pointed us to the solution for how you can, in fact, remove the third party from the process. So I won't tell any more of the sordid details of the story, but I find it interesting that an effort to prove that you couldn't remove third parties, in fact, pointed the way towards the solution, which effectively is to make events so widely witnessed that everyone functions as a collective third party. And that by linking everyone's records together, we could complete the proof.
Wow, that's that's the innovative mind in progress. That's like a snapshot into, really the whole process behind an actual innovation coming to life. I love that. That's a great story.
I think, just to add a codicil to it before you go on to the next question, the way I think of it is, everyone talks about distributed, decentralized as being not everyone, but many people view decentralization and distributed trust as the ends, whereas we stumbled upon it as the means to the ends of creating immutable records.
Fascinating. One of the things, Scott, I saw you speaking at a conference recently, and I was so inspired by your presentation. And one of the things you started off with that really resonated is that you said blockchains aren't really new. And you referenced ancient systems and really how records were, came about back then. So I was wondering if you could sort of elaborate on some of those ancient systems like indentures and how that relates to blockchain.
Sure. And again, it's part of my shtick, I guess, if you will, that big ideas are old ideas and they just resurface in different forms because it's all about the social embedding of what matters. And my two examples that you've offered, is one, anciently, when parties agreed to something, they would assemble a cast of witnesses. They would memorialize the agreement in some permanent record, and then the witnesses were party to the fact that this record engraved in stone tablets or whatever we are witnesses to this connecting of the concept of the agreement to the record that it's memorialized on. And then they went off their own direction. And if the issue was ever challenged, you could reassemble the party of witnesses. And that marked the proof of the event. That, in fact, is at the heart of the wedding ceremony, though most people don't realize that they're not there for the cake. They're there to be the widely distributed witnesses of the wedding. And more modern, but still ancient to us version of that is in what we know today as an indenture. We think when a modern ear hears the word indenture, you think, well, it's an indentured servant, so has something to do with slavery, and that's bad. So let's move on to some other topic. But an indenture has a neutral meaning. It's a contract, but it's a contract made in triplicate on the same sheet of paper and then torn apart deliberately along ragged edges. Having each party, as well as an outside party, a third party, gets the identical copy of the contract. And if it's ever called into question, if one version of the contract is ever called into question, the records are reassembled. And because you ripped it along a jagged edge, the pieces only fit together if they're authentic copies. And that's why it's called an indenture. It comes from the same root as dentures or teeth that are matched together. So this is two examples of the blockchain concept from, massively time-shifted societies, but accomplishing the same thing. What's really happened with us is that we can now do it not in a local village, but in a global village at scale, so that it becomes a universal record.
Scott, as you point out, that blockchain has very wide applicability. I can imagine you dreaming up all kinds of use cases for the blockchain when you were thinking about these issues. I'd like to hear your thoughts on the blockchain's applicability to finance. Historically, TradFi or traditional finance has relied on trusted third parties, banks, clearinghouses, regulators for custody, settlement, validate the transactions. But your work seemed to introduce the notion, or led to the notion, that technology could perform that role of the intermediaries. So with TradFi, with institutional intermediaries, although they're imperfect and costly, they do benefit from the rule of law, established reputations, and regulatory backstops that scale arguably more economically for large value transactions. And some would suggest that a Nakamoto-style Bitcoin consensus at financial scale would cost impracticably high amounts to secure against theft. And we've heard a lot of instances of theft, especially recently. How should regulators think about their role in a system where trust is increasingly embedded in code rather than in institutions?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, I'm a bit Pollyannish about the future. I'm happy to admit that Bayesian prior. And I do think regulators have a role, but if I could rewind the tape just a little bit, the first statement I'd like to nudge a little bit is that we never thought about the concept of disintermediation. What we thought about was we were spreading the trust burden over the collective that's involved in the process. We were distributing the trust across all players. Okay. And the reason that I start with that as my philosophical starting point is it then suggests that the different entities simply play a new set of roles, not that someone's role is eliminated. Okay. So let me speak first to the banks and so forth. The fact that you've distributed trust collectively, okay, and very broadly, doesn't presume that there won't be economies of scale that appear as you centralize some of the functions. Again, remember, for us, decentralization was not a sacred principle. It was a means to an end that we wanted to achieve. And so the mix of centralization and decentralization, to my initial philosophy, Dr. Haber's and our initial philosophy, is less sacrosanct. It's a system that everyone can trust, is what we're interested in. And so, to the extent that economies of scale lead naturally to some centralizing forces to balance out those decentralized forces, we're nonplussed by that. And in a similar fashion, the role for regulators is still valuable, because to me, what works best is a sharing of the burden between technology and legal recourse. In other words, some things you can prevent from ever happening. Technology can sometimes do that, but some things still happen, and the most efficient way of managing them is not to prevent them from happening, but to sort of softly and carry a big stick. People knowing that if they're caught, the recourse is severe, and that, separates the moral hazard from encroaching. And so I'm a kumbaya kind of person. We need things like banks, and we will in a blockchain future. We need regulatory effect so that legal recourse is the kind of long temporal arm of justice being realized, but technology can speed up the vast majority of the interactions. Now, I want to come to the very back end of your point about scalability with Bitcoin. To me, it's important to understand that Bitcoin and blockchain, as many people have said, are not the same. And that, quite frankly, the proof of work solution, which is at the heart of a lot of the inefficiencies, perceived by some as necessary inefficiencies, the proof of work system is really not part of where we were going. Ours would, if you anachronistically tried to place our original thinking into the modern world, it would be much more of a proof of stake system, which obviously is much more energy efficient. And proof of stake, again, is something that is actually foreshadowed in the original of the 3 papers that as a suite really kind of define the blockchain. This distribution of trust amongst a randomly selected subset of parties is part of what's built into the first paper. It's just that no one reads it. And so people, rediscovered proof of stake as this innovative idea that would improve the efficiency. But that just goes to the long story abbreviated by the not suitable for work acronym RTFM. So
Yeah, very interesting. I think it's so true.
Yeah. So I very much think that blockchain principles can be applied into very scalable and efficient systems, and I think there's a move in that direction. Again, I know that I've alienated some of the listeners because I've disclosed that I'm not a Bitcoin maximalist. I feel that what Satoshi did was a beautiful tour de force, but sort of as a work of art and as a first inning in a multi-inning game. I mean, again, we come not to bury Satoshi, but to praise him. But even if you look at the title, Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. It certainly is not cash. Okay, highly traceable. Okay, it isn't even meeting the constraints of money by the threefold test, because its dominant role is not to be a medium of exchange. It's a store of hoped for increasing value, and it's certainly not used as a unit of account in any sense of a dominant mode of use. And so I think Satoshi has to get all the credit that he deserves, but a recognition that it's fallen short of even his aspiration for it. but it doesn't mean it's not a darn good start. And it added tremendous value on top of what we had done, which is really just the data integrity layer for a universal ledger. And again, we feel that that's a meaningful accomplishment, but what he added to it and the sense of possibility that it created, you know, deservedly stands as one of the great innovations of the 21st century. But it's not the end game.
No.
It's not Venus, coming out of the head of Zeus in perfect form right at the beginning.
Well, one perhaps later iteration on application of blockchain technology is stablecoins. And I think you've pointed to stablecoins as perhaps a more constructive application. Why do you suppose that is, if that's right? Why do you suppose that is, and why do you think stablecoins may be closer to your original vision?
Well, I think stablecoins, first of all, I am on the record saying I think stablecoins are a good thing, good innovation. I don't want to take credit as them being, the right implementation of what we were thinking of all along. We didn't have all the ideas. And, just to put it in perspective in a different way, and then I'll come back to stablecoins. There was a moment 5 or 6 years ago when someone sent me this poster about this big, that had to unfold, and it had all the logos of all the companies that were working in all these different areas of blockchain related work. And I just wanted to cry to think that this kind of a thing had come, off of a smaller foundation that we had laid. Because on the one hand, you're talking about a theoretical physicist and a mathematician, and those are people with real egos. And so at the time, what we did, we thought was pretty darn significant. But we had no idea, thinking about all of the imaginative innovation that has since kind of blossomed on top of it. So it's both kind of self-gratifying, but also very humbling to realize that, you were a layer in a chain of activity that's becoming richer all the while. I think stablecoins, coming to the specific example, are a great way to perhaps an intermediate stage to gain some of the efficiencies of being able to transact. And most stablecoins, I'm guessing, are running on Ethereum, which is now a proof of work network and therefore less costly. Stablecoins do this kind of hybrid blending of, well, we're still relying on fiat currencies, okay? But the fiat currencies that we're relying on are pretty stable. And as a result, we can play out some of the benefits that were supposed to come from blockchain-based currencies without the, enormous swings of speculative volatility that we see in a Bitcoin itself. So I think they're a good way of kind of clearing back some of the clutter and letting you see what can be possible with stable coins. I was speaking at a board of directors meeting for one of the nation's larger banks. And I said, don't worry about the cryptocurrencies. Focus on the stable coins. Okay? That's where, in a sense, your competition is coming. And you see that, and I know I'm jumping a little off the topic or maybe ahead of where you're going, but that the legislation that came in, and I'm no expert on the legislation, but it basically says stablecoins can't do interest bearing. And, that's an obvious kind of hack that says, well, we could get this legislation through by satisfying the banks by saying, well, no interest bearing, because otherwise they become, more close to a direct threat and competitor. And I think it's true, but quite frankly, that's just an intermediate state. The water flows downhill, and eventually that will, start to happen one way or another. And that was why I was recommending to this particular bank, for whom I have great respect, that, if you want to skate to where the puck is headed, and this was 4 years ago, you need to look at stablecoins as the real potential disruptive innovation.
Mhm.
And part of the response was, yeah, but we're moving toward a protocol amongst the banks where we can instantly transfer funds. I said, you're missing the point. It's not just the speed, it's the flexibility and the fact that the money can become programmable and automated. It's not just the point A to bank B that we can do, in minutes instead of days. It's what happens at point A and point B as well. And so, yes, to sum it all up, I think stablecoins are a big step forward. Do I think there's a way to progress beyond being pegged to fiat currencies? I do. I have some thoughts about that, some of which are others talk about, and some of which everyone ignores because they dismiss them. But baskets of currencies or baskets of goods, I think, are a possibility. The problem, of course, is the incentive structure to get any existing fiat currency to want to surrender to a basket of currencies or a basket of goods. There's no incentive there. And so, yeah, I think we're going to have stable coins for a while. I think they're going to be a good thing. And, I would consider them maybe the third or fourth inning in a 9-inning game. I'm headed to a baseball game later tonight. So I guess I got innings on my mind. Yeah, good step forward.
Yeah.
I think that's a fascinating concept just by thinking about what could, instead of fiat, could back the stable coins. And I think you're right on target with that. I think that we are moving into something that's more of a more tangible assets, maybe perhaps even data, something that's, incredibly valuable. So that will be really interesting to see how that plays out. But I really do want to pivot to this next game-changing innovation that you're working on now, AI. And, this is something now that big topic of conversation. And I was recently watching your interview you did on CNBC, and you said, seeing is no longer believing and hearing is no longer believing. And, maybe you could talk a little bit about that and, how we've crossed that line and what that means.
Sure. Again, since it's my shtick, let me start with some historical context. My PhD at Stanford was in the physics department, but it was actually the first dissertation whose main topic was neural networks that Stanford issued. And so it's not that I made any great contributions, but the reason I mention it is I've been thinking about AI for a long, long time.
Mm.
And it's been very exciting to see in the December 22, November 22, 2022 world of ChatGPT, that AI is becoming a tremendous innovation engine. And again, back to Pollyannish Scott, I think it's going to deliver huge benefits, but there are some adjustment issues that are going to be required. And one of them is that synthetic creation of audio and video, including real-time audio and video, is going to make what's real from what's fake indistinguishable. That's what we mean by seeing is no longer believing. And so what do we need is, that begs the question. And the analogy I like is to think about early airplane flight. Airplanes originally only flew in clear weather and at heights that you could still keep track of all the landmarks on the ground, take off, fly roughly west, until you see this river and then bear left, and then you'll see an airport appear and then land. Okay. But as speeds increased and altitudes increased and the desire to be able to handle air flight 24/7, the need for instrument-based navigation arose. Okay. Because when you get up in the clouds and it's a storm, your whole vestibular system, your seeing is believing system disorients you and actually leads you in the wrong direction. And so you need to master flying by instrument. And so My point is we're heading for some very stormy, cloudy weather. And so we need to learn to adapt and adopt a new set of tools akin to flying by instrument, navigating by instrument. And that's where we think Shermark and others in the space will come in. So from our perspective, we don't want to try to defeat deepfakes. We don't even want to try to detect deepfakes. What we really want to do is to make deepfakes irrelevant so that we can get on with our human-to-human interaction and the business of commerce without having to pay any attention at all to deepfake. And that's what Shermark is attempting to do. So rather than trying to detect something, we are trying to assert identity in a way that can't be easily thwarted. Yeah, I feel like we're trying to detect deepfakes using AI deepfakes using AI algorithms is you pick up that stick, the other end of the stick, it gets worse and worse. It's like fighting an asymmetric economic war on the wrong side. And what we want to do is flip the script. We want to make it harder and harder and more expensive for bad guys to try to impersonate people and easier to assert identity. And that's how the Shermark system is designed.
So, Scott, if I hear you correctly and understand, instead of asking, is this a fake? Your approach asks, is this verified? So if that's correct, can you explain what cryptographic identity verification means in practice and how that might reshape both institutions and regulators' approach to trust?
Sure. So, we're talking and we're having a good conversation, and I have no reason to suspect that you're not Mark or Nick or Dara. But in an age where seeing is no longer believing and hearing is no longer believing, I have no evidence that you're Mark or Nick or Dara. And the Shermark application, which, sits on your iPhone, is something that allows you in real time to challenge the parties that you're engaged with a very simple in a cryptographic sense, test that they have to respond to, meaning their software has to respond to. It's not a quiz like, what's the air velocity of a European sparrow? It's not, some sort of Monty Python trick question, but you press a button that says, prove to me that I'm talking to the Mark Hiraide. Is that right?
Yes.
I just came back from Japan.
Good pronunciation.
And I used to live in Japan a long time ago. At any rate, is this the person that I think it is, or is it someone else? Maybe someone with the same name, but not the same person. At any rate, they receive on their smartphone a so-called cryptographic challenge, which if they have the true Mark Hiraide credential, their software can respond to it. And then I can know, apart from not having to trust anyone else in the world, that it really is Mark or Nick or Dara, and then we can get on with our conversation. That's something that we call Sure Circle. And it works. It works for two reasons. It works because we bind your identity to this credential in a way that even we can't cheat about it. And that, of course, is emblematic of the distributed trust mechanism. And then once your identity is properly bound to that credential, then only that credential can respond to the challenges that are placed on it. The one way I would describe what's different about what we do is think of a conventional background check, let's say that the FBI would conduct for people that are nominated for positions that have to be approved by the Senate, right? The FBI does this extensive background check, draws in all of this various information, interviews all sorts of people, and then asserts that the FBI says this person is, trustworthy or this person is clean. But what the FBI is really saying is, we've looked at all the data. Trust us. It has the FBI seal of approval. What we do at Suremark is not that. We say, here's all the data. Anyone can draw the same conclusion we've drawn. And so again, we are distributing the responsibility of managing reality to the entire community.
As you're describing this, the implications for the securities markets sort of leap out, and I'm sure you've already considered this, but I just came back from a conference of hedge fund operations people, and one of their big concerns is the requirements under the Know Your Customer rules, either the SEC or FINRA. And they were describing the deepfake technology that's out there, and this method of taking a picture of your driver's license and sending that in, and they readily acknowledge that that just doesn't work so easily. So if companies can no longer trust more traditional ways of establishing identity, that has implications for our securities markets. Do you see identity uncertainty as a financial stability issue, something regulators are going to have to address in cases where they haven't yet addressed it?
No, I see banks, the smart ones, getting Suremark credentials sooner rather than later.
Yeah.
And if I pursue that thread any further, this will turn into a sales pitch. So why don't we just
Move on. Yeah.
move on?
That
Again, the core grounding of identity for Suremark does not rest in either biometrics nor state issued IDs. Fundamentally, and I know I'm being glib about a technical topic, you prove who you are by showing who you know.
Mm.
And that becomes essentially unforgeable as the depth and breadth of your vouching network grows. It's akin to the challenge that someone has with Bitcoin of mounting a 51% attack.
Mm.
It's an exponentially unwinnable battle for the bad guys.
Mm.
I like that. So when you look ahead 10 to 20 years, let's say, what do you think the world looks like, both with respect to, the how blockchain is evolving as well as AI? Where do you see the world? What is it looking like in 10 to 20 years?
It's going to be great.
Mhm.
Although I have to again issue my pet peeve about people that make 10 and 20-year forecasts. Namely, I was just talking to one of my sons about this, my adult sons, and I've got 6 grandkids, 3 kids. And I say, isn't it remarkable how everyone puts out a book that says, we are truly at a hinge point in history. Because of X, the old models are no longer valid. Here's what the next 10 to 20 years are actually going to be like. And then 3 years later, someone comes out with a book and says, because of this recent innovation, Y, we are now truly at a hinge point in history. The old models don't work. Here's what the next 10 to 20 years is going to be like. So you'd think that people would wise up to the fact that this is just the book publishing industry and the speaker circuit.
All right.
It's a black swan event on a predictable schedule. Okay. So I'm happy to talk about maybe 3 to 5 years. Okay. And the first thing that I would say, and I'm circling back to AI specifically, AI has enormous opportunity for growth. Okay. And the idea that we're all going to lose our jobs, or that we're all going to be taken over by our AI superlords, it's just not going to work that way. Again, I give a lecture sometimes where I say there's 3 myths that are, that need to be dealt with. The first is AI superlords are going to take over the world. The second is none of us will have any jobs. And the third is we won't be able to tell reality from what's fake. And I say the answer to the question is no, AI is not going to take over the world. Here's why, blah, blah, blah. No, we will not all lose our jobs. Here's why, blah, blah, blah. And yes, you won't be able to tell truth from fake. So get a SureMark credential. But, with respect to the jobs issue, this is a oft discussed thing, but there are many reasonable economists that explain that it just doesn't work that way. That it's not even that there's this micro alignment where, well, AI will create the job for AI maintainers or AI service people. It's a much more macro argument than that. Fundamentally, if AI adds value, if there's value creation, okay, then GDP goes up and disposable income increases, and people will find something that they need that they never knew they needed before. There's this classic line in Adam Smith. I could pull it up if I had a second, but he basically says, rest assured that, no matter how much, increase in wealth there is, people's, sort of social status and other drivers, their insatiable demand for new things means that all the money's going to get spent. And, hence there will be jobs. And, it's a little like, what's the Malthus, people say that the reason that Malthus was right is that he's been wrong so many times, generation after generation. And, the people that say, well, the agricultural revolution is going to wipe out all of the jobs and 90% of us are farmers. So what will we do when only 3% of the population is needed to provide more food than we could have ever imagined? And the same thing with the Industrial Revolution. And my favorite, more recent example, at least from the 1900s, is, in the 1920s, what the single largest job occupation was?
Yeah.
Telephone operators. Okay. There are no telephone operators anymore. And yet, somehow, we found other jobs.
Yeah.
And it's because, it goes back to human nature and the fact that needs are insatiable. Or one of my favorite little couplets is, there, little luxury, don't you cry. You'll be a necessity by and by.
Scott.
What do you think people and policymakers are still getting wrong today about blockchain and AI?
Well, on the AI front, I'd say let's regulate the outcomes, not try to guess what's the problem is going to be before it's even evident. And so to me, a lot of the safety AI discussion, I think, is right-hearted but wrong-headed. With respect to blockchain, again, I think this is a bit of a harder pill for some to swallow, but I'm reminded of something that Warren Buffett said. I know he said a lot of things, but he said, the best investment decision I ever made was to be born in the United States in the 20th century. Okay? And the point he was making is the American economy, and I know I'm being a little parochial now, not speaking to worldwide, is an enormous engine of growth, despite all of the problems that we have with it. And prosperity comes not by insisting that we couple everything to the US dollar, but by grounding things in the innovation engine that is the American economy. And so that's the sure foundation. That's what Warren Buffett was saying was his best investment decision was to be born at the right time in the right place. I think if we can relax a little the notion that it's possible to maintain sovereignty as a nation without insisting that the only legal tender be what it is today, that I think is the, to use a physicist's words, that's the asymptotic good state. Now, getting from here to there, I admit is challenging, because just because an ex-physicist or a former physicist tells you that asymptotically everything's going to work out, that doesn't get you reelected or whatever. So, look, I think a lot of regulators, the non-grandstanding ones, really are trying to do a good job across an uncertain future, but I think they need to ground themselves on preventing and creating a high moral hazard barrier to improper behavior as it manifests itself, rather than trying to guess at what in the technology needs to be changed before there's any evidence of negative outcome. Better informed, lighter regulation is my nirvana.
Wow, I think that is a fantastic place to leave the discussion. Scott, thank you so much for coming on. To Mark and Dara, thank you as always for co-hosting. For everyone else, if you want more information about ICANN, please go to icanlaw.org, and we'll see you on the next Capital Ideas. Thank you.